The cage had no bars. That was the first thing Mara noticed when she came to. Not the cold of the floor, not the ache in her temples, not the smell of something like overripe melon that hung in the recycled air. The cage had no bars because it didn't need them. The walls were glass, or whatever passed for glass out here, and beyond them moved shapes and colors she didn't have names for yet. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. It hummed back, a low, polite frequency. The kind of vibrations that said, "You're not going anywhere, and we're not sorry about it." She sat up slowly. The enclosure was roughly the size of a studio apartment. There was a cot bolted down, a metal basin with running water, cold, a toilet behind a half partition, shelves with objects, a paperback book swollen with humidity, a coffee mug chipped at the rim with someone else's lipstick on it, a coil of rope, a mirror. Someone had arranged it to look inhabited, to look human, and done it the same way you'd stuff a diorama, technically correct in every dimension except feeling. Mara stood. She was still wearing what she'd had on when they took her. Cargo pants, a flannel over a thermal, boots laced tight. She didn't know how long she'd been out. Long enough that her mouth was brick dry and her left hand had gone to pins and needles from lying on it. She walked the perimeter. 8 steps by 11. She counted twice. Beyond the glass, aliens moved like water through a crowd. They were tall, taller than anything she'd grown up imagining, and they moved on 2 legs, which she'd also imagined, but wrong. They moved with a lateral sway, a subtle side-to-side shift in the hips that looked like they were compensating for a different center of gravity, like their weight sat higher than it should. Their heads were wide, flattened at the crown, with eyes set so far apart she had to remind herself she was seeing faces and not masks. 3 fingers on each hand, but long, with 1 extra joint. They wore what looked like clothing, draped, layered in colors that shifted between viewing angles. But whether for modesty or warmth or status, she couldn't say. One stopped in front of her enclosure. It pressed its own hand to the other side of the glass. 3 fingers splayed. Its eyes were fixed on her with something she couldn't read. Not hunger, not cruelty. The worst thing about it was the expression it wore, mild, curious, interested, the look of someone at an aquarium. Mara held its gaze for a count of 4. Then she turned her back and walked to the cot and sat down facing the wall. She heard something from the adjacent enclosure. A human voice, male, low, like he'd been trying to decide whether to say anything for a while, and finally committed. First day's the worst. She didn't look up. Where are we? Nobody's sure. Not even them. I mean, they know, they just don't tell us. A pause. I'm Daniel. Mara, how'd they get you? She thought about the parking garage, the hum, the flash that wasn't lightning. Same way they got everyone, I imagine. There was a sound through the wall. Glass, or whatever it was, wasn't quite soundproof. Daniel laughed, short and humorless. Yeah, they had a system. Not she and Daniel alone. There were 6 enclosures in the row, and over the following hours she learned all their names. Yuki, who was a structural engineer and had spent her first 3 weeks mapping every frequency the walls emitted. Bram, who was older, who had been here the longest, who'd stopped counting the days around what he estimated was the 4-month mark. Lena, who sang quietly when the lights dimmed, not out of hope but because she said silence was worse. And Jonas, who didn't talk much, who watched the alien visitors with an intensity that unnerved everyone else, but that Mara privately understood. They had rules. The enclosures were cleaned every what felt like 72 hours. During cleaning, 2 sentinels entered each enclosure. They were larger than the tourists, darker in coloration, their clothing more uniform, and they moved differently. Precise, deliberate, with none of the wandering gait of the visiting crowds. The humans had learned not to make sudden movements during cleaning. Yuki had made a sudden movement once, reflexively, when a sentinel reached past her for the waste receptacle. The sentinel had responded with a sound, not loud, that had dropped everyone in the enclosure to their knees in a kind of full-body clench. It was a frequency, she'd explained afterward, aimed, like a taser, but from the air. They didn't use it often, which Mara took to mean it wasn't the preferred method, which meant there were worse methods, which she filed away. She spent the first 3 days watching the tourists. They came in groups or pairs or alone. They moved along the row of enclosures with that lateral sway, pausing at each one, consulting something that Mara couldn't see. A device, she figured, held at waist level and then looking up. Most of them didn't tap the glass. They'd clearly been told not to, the way you'd tell a child not to tap the glass at an aquarium. Some of them watched the humans move, watched them eat, watched them interact. One group had what looked like young among them, smaller versions, pulling at the limbs of the adults, impatient in the way that children everywhere, apparently, were impatient. And one of the young ones did tap the glass, and the adult nearest it made a quick, corrective gesture. The universal parental, we don't do that. They have a guide, Jonas told her on the 4th day. Comes by every day, same time, talks about us. You can see the tourists look at us differently after, like they've gotten the facts. What facts? Mara asked. Jonas's jaw tightened. Whatever story they're telling. On the morning of the 5th day, she found the gap. She'd been pressing along the bottom seam of the rear wall, not because she expected anything, but because Yuki had told her the frequencies concentrated at the seams, and Mara was cataloging. She pressed her palm along the junction of wall and floor and felt, not the usual hum, a skip, a microsecond break in the vibration, like a hiccup. She kept her face neutral. She moved away. She waited until the lights cycled down for what served as night, and then she went back and pressed again. It was there, a gap in the field, roughly palm-sized, at the floor level, back corner, where the wall met the baseboard of whatever the flooring system was. Not a physical gap, the glass was unbroken, but a gap in the energy, in the frequency that kept the panel sealed and the walls impassable. She didn't know what caused it. Maybe a manufacturing flaw. Maybe age. Maybe the alignment had shifted slightly over time and no one had recalibrated. She thought of Yuki, who had spent 3 weeks mapping frequencies, and she thought about how they'd all adapted to this place in the ways that felt most natural. Bram by going quiet, Lena by singing, Jonas by watching, Yuki by engineering, and her, she pressed her hand to the gap and felt the break in the field hold steady, her by looking for the thing that wasn't working right. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She spent the next 4 days learning the gap. It wasn't large enough to walk through. It wasn't a hole. It was a resonance gap, which meant the field was weakened, not absent, but she thought it might be enough to disrupt. She thought about the rope on the shelf. She thought about the frequency of the sentinels' disabling sound. She thought about the tour guide, who came every morning at the same time, who moved along the row with a group of tourists and paused at each enclosure and produced, from somewhere in those draped layers, a small device that it held up and spoke into, an amplifier, a directional speaker. It was projecting something toward the glass when it addressed the group. Some kind of explanation or commentary that the tourists received on their own devices, a frequency within a frequency. She watched it. She watched the way the tourists' attention tracked to it, to the device, to the guide's movements. They were watching the guide explain them. She thought, if I can reach that device. It took 2 more days to work out how. The gap in the field was in the rear corner. The cleaning protocol required the sentinels to move through the enclosure. During cleaning, the front panel, the panel facing the viewing corridor, was briefly depressurized to allow airflow, not opened, depressurized. The pressure differential that kept it sealed was momentarily reduced. Yuki had noticed this, the pop in her ears during cleaning, and had dismissed it as a side effect of the ventilation system. Mara had not dismissed it. She worked through it in her head the way she'd worked through every systems problem she'd ever faced. Reverse from what you want. She wanted to reach the corridor. The corridor was accessible during the pressure differential. The pressure differential occurred during cleaning. Cleaning occurred with 2 sentinels inside the enclosure. 2 sentinels meant the disabling frequency could be deployed. She needed a way to disrupt the sentinels before they could use it. The rope, she told Daniel. She didn't tell him everything. She told him what she needed, a distraction, timed to the moment the sentinels came through the front. She needed them both looking at one thing for roughly 4 seconds. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "What are you going to do with 4 seconds?" he asked. "I'm going to get into the corridor. And then, one thing at a time." Another pause. "If they catch you, I know." She heard him breathing. She heard, faintly, Lena's voice from the far end of the row, a low melodic sound, not quite a song. She thought of her daughter, who would be 8 now, who liked to hum in the car the way small children do, unselfconsciously, just to fill the air with something. She thought of her sister, who would have gone to the authorities by now, who would have made noise, because her sister always made noise. She pressed her hand to the gap in the wall and felt the field skip, faithful as ever. "Okay," Daniel said. The next cleaning cycle, Mara was ready. She'd braided the rope in the night, not into a weapon, into a knot, specifically a bowline, a loop that couldn't slip that she could drop over something and pull from a distance. She'd practiced tying it with her eyes closed, in the dark, until her hands knew the shape of it without instruction. The sentinels came through on schedule. Daniel was already in motion on his side of the glass, doing something she couldn't see, something loud. She didn't look. She watched the 2 sentinels track the sound, both heads turning, that wide-set gaze orienting, and she counted. 1. She moved to the rear corner, her hand on the gap in the field. 2. She felt the pressure differential in her eardrums, the front panel cycling, the hum dropping a fraction. 3. She pushed, not with her hand, with the rope's loop, which she'd pressed into the gap at floor level, braced against the seam. The field at the gap skipped and the rope end coiled, weighted with the mug she'd emptied that morning, swung through. Not through the glass, through the field disruption, just far enough. 4. A sentinel turned back. It saw her. It produced the sound. She'd been expecting it. She was already flat on the floor, hands over her ears, face pressed to the metal. She felt it as a vibration in her jaw, in her sternum, in the backs of her eyes. It was brutal. She held on to herself for the count she'd decided on, 3, and then pushed up. The sentinel advanced. She pulled the rope. The mug, on its loop end in the corridor, swung wide and struck the tour guide's amplifier device, which was sitting, as it always was at this hour, on the small stand outside the row where the guide staged before beginning the circuit. The device clattered, not broke, clattered. But the sound it made when it struck the floor was picked up, because the device was still on, still transmitting, and sent out on every frequency the device broadcast on. The result was a feedback shriek that propagated through every speaker in the facility. The sentinels both stopped. The tourists, beyond the glass, reacted. The wide-set eyes contracted, limbs pulled in, several moved toward the exits. She could see them from the floor. Were being gathered up by the adults, that universal parental clutch of small bodies toward large ones. In the chaos, Mara pulled herself through the rear gap. Not cleanly, not the way it had worked in her head. The field disruption was designed for the rope's coil, not for a human body, and what she got through was her arm, her shoulder, and roughly a third of her torso before the field reasserted, and she was stuck. She did not panic. She had prepared for this contingency in the same way she'd prepared for everything else, by deciding in advance that she would not stop moving. She moved. She fought for every centimeter. The field wasn't painful, it was resistant, a pressure rather than a current, and she worked against it methodically, rotating, using the seam at the baseboard as leverage. Behind her, she could hear the sentinel sounds. Directed frequencies, short bursts. The tourists had mostly cleared the corridor. She could see, from her half-in, half-out position, the tour guide's amplifier on the floor. She could see the guide itself, now, stopped at the far end of the corridor, watching her with those wide-set eyes. It wasn't advancing. She filed that away. She kept working. Her hip cleared the field, then her legs. She came through with far less grace than she'd imagined and put her hands out just in time to catch herself on the corridor floor, which was cool and smooth and not glass. She lay there for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stood. The tour guide was still watching her. The sentinels would be through the front panel in moments. The front panel would have depressurized fully by now overriding the protocol in response to a breach. She had very little time and one asset, the device on the floor in front of her. She picked it up. It was lighter than she'd expected. It fit her hand in a way that felt wrong. The grip was designed for 3 long fingers, not 5 short ones, but it fit. She looked at the tour guide, who had not moved, who was watching her with that same mild aquarium expression. She said, in the clearest voice she had, "My name is Mara Solis. I'm a structural engineer. I'm from a planet called Earth, and it is not a zoo." She didn't know if the device translated. She didn't know if the guide understood her. She didn't know if anyone was listening on the other end of whatever frequencies the device broadcast on. But she held the device up the same way she'd watched the guide hold it, same angle, same extension, and she said it again. "My name is Mara Solis, and I am going home." The sentinels came through the front panel. She did not run. She'd thought about running. She'd thought about everything she might do once she was in the corridor. The exit routes Yuki had speculated about, the maintenance corridors Jonas had tracked by watching the guide's path, the pressure junctions Daniel had mapped from sound patterns during cleaning. She had all of it in her head like a blueprint. She'd spent 9 days building that blueprint. But she didn't run. She stood in the corridor, holding the device, and she looked at the sentinels and she did not move. Because she had understood, watching the tourists, watching the guide, watching the reactions to the feedback shriek, something that she thought might matter. They hadn't expected any of this. Not the gap in the field, not the rope trick, not the breach, not her standing in their corridor with their device in her hand. They had built a system designed to hold something they believed incapable of designing a system. And they were looking at her now the way the tourist had looked at her on her first day. With something she couldn't read, that wasn't hunger, wasn't cruelty, wasn't certainty anymore. One sentinel made a sound, not the disabling frequency, a different one, a communication. The other sentinel answered. The tour guide moved forward, not toward Mara, to the side of the corridor, to a panel she hadn't noticed, which it pressed with 3 long fingers. A door opened, not her enclosure door, a larger door. At the end of the corridor, past the row of exhibits, past the staging area. A door that led, she could see through it, to somewhere with a different quality of light. Not softer, larger, space beyond it that wasn't calculated. She looked at the tour guide. The tour guide made no gesture. It simply stood beside the open door and waited. Its expression, those wide-set eyes. She thought she saw something in them that she was almost certainly projecting, almost certainly reading through the lens of her own biology and her own desperate hope. But she thought she saw it anyway. Assessment. She walked through the door. What was beyond it was not freedom. She understood that, walking through. She had no ship, no coordinates, no understanding of where she was in any measurable sense. What was beyond it was a room, larger than the enclosure, with a window that was actually a window, a curved transparency looking out at something vast and dark and spackled with light. Stars. She stood in front of it and pressed her palm to the surface. No hum. Real glass or what passed for it. Cold under her hand. Behind her, the door didn't close. The tour guide entered. It moved to stand beside her, also looking out the window. For a long time, neither of them did anything. She was intensely aware of how large it was, how different, how thoroughly not human. Then it made a sound, not a word, not a language she knew, a sound like air moving through a large space. And then, adjacent to that sound, a voice, flat, processed, synthesized. came from the device she was still holding in her hand. The exhibit, the voice said, was designed to show our people what intelligent life looks like. She let that land. You showed them, the voice continued, but not what was intended. She looked at the stars. She thought about Yuki mapping frequencies, Bram going quiet, Lena filling the silence with sound, Jonas watching until he understood, Daniel saying okay. She thought about a bowline knot, which she'd learned from her father, on a dock when she was 7, on a Saturday morning when the lake was flat and it seemed like a reasonable skill for a child to have. She thought about her daughter, 8, in a car, humming. "I'd like to go home," she said. The synthesized voice was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your world, you know its location?" "I know what it looks like from the ground," she said. "I know what the light looks like at 4 in the afternoon in October. I know what the air smells like before it rains." She paused. "But I also know its stellar coordinates. I'm a structural engineer." I prepared. Another silence. Outside the window, the stars didn't care about any of this. They burned with the patience of things that had been doing it for longer than either of them had existed. The tour guide made a sound that wasn't translated. Then it moved back toward the door and gestured, one long arm, toward the corridor beyond. Not a threatening gesture, an inviting one, or the closest thing to an invitation that she could read from a body designed on entirely different principles. She followed. It took 6 hours. She didn't know that at the time. She had no way to track time beyond the rhythms of her own body, her hunger and tiredness, but 6 hours of moving through the facility in a way she'd never seen it. From the inside, past doors and corridors and spaces she hadn't known existed, past other aliens who stopped and watched her with varying degrees of the aquarium expression. One of them reached out toward her, and a sentinel, always trailing just behind, 2 of them, made a short sound, and the reaching arm withdrew. She was not translated. Nobody spoke to her through the device or otherwise, except twice. Once when she stopped at a junction and the tour guide gestured, and the device said simply left, and once near the end, when they reached a room full of equipment she didn't recognize, and the tour guide stood in front of a panel and made sounds, and the device said, "This takes time." She sat on the floor and waited. The sentinels stood. The tour guide worked. She thought about the others. Yuki, Daniel, Bram, Lena. She hadn't asked for them. She hadn't thought to in the moment, and now the thought of it sat in her chest like a stone. She said, to the device, to the tour guide, to the room, the others, in the enclosures. "They come too." No response. "I'm not going without them." The tour guide turned from the panel, that wide-set gaze, that unreadable expression. "They come," Mara said, "or I stay. And if I stay, I will find every gap in every field, in every enclosure in this facility, and I will show every one of them how to use it. And then we will stand in your corridors, all of us, until you open the door." The synthesized voice produced nothing for a long moment. Then, "We know." She waited. "We already know," the voice continued. "Why do you believe we opened the door?" She sat with that. "We observe," the voice said. "It is the purpose of this place. We have observed your kind for 2 of your years. What we have observed." A pause that might have been a translation gap, or might have been deliberate, was not what the exhibit was designed to show. What was it designed to show? Typical behavior of a captured species. She almost laughed. She pressed her lips together and did not. "And what did you see instead?" "Adaptation," the voice said. "Individual specialization in response to constraint. Collective coordination without a shared language. Improvisation under conditions specifically designed to eliminate variables." Another pause. "The rope." She looked at her hands. The rope was still coiled around her forearm, a habit from the knot-making, something she hadn't consciously decided to keep hold of. "The rope," she agreed. "No other species held in this facility," the voice said, "has ever produced a tool from its enclosure's contents." She thought about the mug, the coil, the bowline her father had taught her on a flat lake on a Saturday in October. She thought about the sentinels looking at each other, that exchanged sound, that moment of something that wasn't certainty. She thought about the door opening. It was a pretty basic tool, she said. Yes, the voice said. That is the point. They went back for the others. She didn't know what conversations happened on their end, in their languages, in the facility's other rooms. She didn't know what was agreed to or negotiated or decided by whatever authority existed beyond the tour guide and the sentinels and the device in her hand. She knew that by the time they reached the enclosure row again, all 6 panels were open. She knew that Daniel was standing in the corridor with his hands at his sides, and an expression on his face that she recognized as the specific face people make when they're afraid to believe something. She knew that Yuki had, characteristically, her hand pressed to the open edge of the panel, measuring the gap. The field's off, Yuki said when Mara reached her, not lowered, off. Yeah, Mara said. How did you? Rope trick, Daniel said from down the corridor. She'll explain later. Bram came out last. He was moving slowly, the way someone moves when they've stopped trusting surfaces to hold them. He looked at the corridor, at the aliens keeping their distance, at Mara. His voice was very quiet when he spoke. Are we actually leaving? She looked at the tour guide, the wide-set eyes. The expression she'd spent 9 days learning to misread and was still only beginning to understand. Yeah, she said, we're leaving. It wasn't a ship they were put on, or not what she'd imagined a ship to be. It was a space, pressurized and temperature-controlled, that moved. That was all she could determine from the inside. No windows, no controls visible to her, no sense of thrust or acceleration, only the fact of movement communicated by a low vibration in the floor that was entirely different from the hum of the enclosure walls. This one felt like intention, like distance being crossed. They sat together on the floor of the space because there were no chairs sized for them. Lena had started humming again, which Mara had expected. Yuki was drawing on the surface of the floor with her thumbnail, invisible marks, but she was drawing them. Jonas had finally stopped watching the door and was looking at his hands instead. Bram had his eyes closed. Daniel was looking at Mara. You had this whole time, didn't you? He said. Not a question. No, she said. I had the gap for a while. The rest I worked out. The rope, the mug, the feedback. The mug was the backup. The feedback was the distraction. The gap was the only part I actually planned. He was quiet for a moment. What made you think it would work? She thought about it honestly. I didn't, she said. I thought it was worth trying. He nodded. Outside the space, the ship, she supposed she should start calling it that. There was nothing to hear. No sound of passage, no Doppler of stars. Only Lena's low, persistent hum and the vibration in the floor and 6 humans sitting close together in the dark, the way humans sit when they're not sure what comes next but have decided to find out. She still had the device in her hand. She hadn't planned to keep it, but no one had taken it back. She turned it over, 3-fingered grip, alien construction, calibrated for frequencies she didn't have names for. She thought about what it had said. No other species has ever produced a tool. She thought about the dock. Her father's hands on a Saturday morning, slow and patient, looping rope into a shape that wouldn't fail. She thought about what he'd said when she asked him why that one specifically, why the bowline. He'd said, because once it's set, nothing pulls it loose. That's the only knot worth knowing, the one that holds. She closed her hand around the device. The ship hummed. They were going home.